All right, and we're recording. Awesome. Great. So, hello, everybody. Welcome to the This is Public Health book club discussion. We're the first book club discussion of 2021. Yeah. So, I hope everybody had a great holiday season and New Year. So what we thought we would do is, we take a second to introduce ourselves, so we're not total internet strangers, and then just jump into some of the book discussion questions we got through the Goodreads site. So my name is Anthony Sirachi. I am a PhD student at the Brown University School of Public Health. My research focuses on alcohol use among the LGBT community. Yeah, and Ashley, if you want to introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Hi, my name is Ashley Fenton, and I go to Louisiana State University Health Science Center, and I'm getting my PhD in Community Health Sciences under the School of Public Health. My research interest is food insecurity among children, and I'm ready to get into this discussion with everybody today.
Yeah. And so as we posted on our Goodreads page, this book club for 2021, we're starting off with the book Evicted by Matthew Desmond. It's Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City. It's sort of a overview or a case study of lower income housing in Milwaukee. Yeah, so I mean, I think this book is a lot, like in a lot of ways. I don't know, Ashley, what your reaction's been, but I feel like every page I'm like just feeling heartbroken constantly, but also like I have a lot of feelings. I don't know, like, yeah, tell me what your reaction to the book was so far.
Yeah, so as I was reading this book, it was a lot of emotion because they've only had so much money. Sometimes they're getting that government assistance, and most of their paycheck is going just to rent, and they have maybe 5 people living in a 1-bedroom apartment or like a small apartment. And it's almost like, as I was reading it, it was almost like landlords just found a way to evict people to not only get their previous rent, but then their current rent and then someone else's rent. And I don't know, it just seemed like a very vicious cycle in those first 4 chapters for me.
Yeah, it just felt very much like it's, just like exactly like you just said, like a vicious cycle. It's just like this self-sustaining cycle of like eviction and homelessness and poverty and just never ending. But I thought it'd be helpful to take a step back and like give some folks some like context for this book. So yeah, this book, I think in a lot of ways this book, obviously it's a very specific slice of the American life. This is a very specific part of the country, a very specific population. And this also took place, I think the book took place around 2007, 2008, so like around 12 years ago. But that being said, I think there's a lot of ways in which the issues and the content of the book is applicable to, just is applicable to a lot of things in American society and culture and public health also as well.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's very much a microcosm of some of the shortcomings of the systems we live in currently, and kind of how, like I think you were just saying, like how the landlords learn to exploit that system. Because I think, to me at least, one of the most interesting characters to me at least is the character of Sharina, because so for those who have maybe not read the book, Sharina is a landlord. She works in the north. She owns property in the north side of Milwaukee, which is a very low-income neighborhood. It's also a neighborhood predominantly populated by people of color, and she is unique in a lot of ways. She was a school teacher for a long time, and she found that work wasn't fulfilling. So through it's I don't want to go into too much detail, but through the kind of circumstances she found herself in, she found she could make a lot more money in real estate than teaching. I mean, obviously, you can probably make money in any other professions like in teaching, but that's beyond the point. But she's also unique in that she is also a woman of color, and most landlords, particularly in this part of the city, are predominantly cisgender white individuals, white men specifically. So she is unique in a lot of ways. So I don't know. I found her interesting because she seems to have a lot of compassion for a lot of her tenants, but at the same time, she doesn't seem to have a problem with evicting them for not more or less no reason. I mean, I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Sharina.
Yeah. So she seems like a very kind-hearted person, but at the same time, she's still in that businesswoman mindset, kind of like, I'm not gonna go without rent because you won't pay your rent or things like that. So I think she means well, or kind of wants to mean well, but at this, you know, some cycles, like, money makes the world go round. She does need the money to not only upkeep the building that she barely upkeeps, but but she also needs it to pay her bills past those buildings. So it kind of puts her in a weird position because she knows that they're struggling and she knows that they do need help, but she also understands, like, if they don't pay their rent, I lose money and I can't not succeed necessarily, but I can't pay what I need to be paid, or what she needs to be paid, or what she needs to pay. So it's just, again, like a cycle of, like, she needs to be paid so she can pay things, but when they don't pay, it's just not, she can't do anything with that for long periods of time. So she gives them a break. I have seen that, but clearly, I mean, if they don't make enough income, they're never going to catch up with what some of these rents are at, like the level that they are at. So
yeah, I mean, what struck me as being interesting, like, from the way that the author describes the situation, it really sounds like this particular business model of landlording, like, is kind of predicated on the idea that you will evict your tenants relatively, like, there's a hard turnover amount, because, like, they can charge them really high amounts in rents, like oftentimes like almost their entire monthly income in a lot of cases, and not really, and while in theory they're beholden to upkeep the property, it sounds from the way that the laws appear to be written, they can also at the same time evict tenants for I forgot the specific term. I don't know if you remember it, but for basically I think a no reason eviction or something to that effect. So like,
I don't remember the
yeah. So for example, like, if a tenant calls the Department of Housing Services because of, like, let's say plumbing issues that the landlord has neglected, or for whatever reason, by law the landlord can evict them for doing that, but they can evict them for no reason. So, like, they, in theory, so theoretically the law prevents retributive evictions, but it seems as though in practice that's really not the case at all. Yeah, I'm curious, like, if you notice other instances where, like, you know, legislation in the book, like, kind of reinforces, like, that kind of inequality, or like that sort of cycle, let's say.
I can't exactly remember the certain situation. I think, and I'm trying to make sure that it's not in future chapters past 1 through 4.
Fair.
But there was one situation, I just won't use, like, names, but there was one situation where they had too many people in their living space according to the contract that they had. And so, but they had things on their property that needed to be fixed. He wouldn't fix them. But they in turn they felt like they couldn't call the housing services, because if they had called, she would have gotten upset and she would have been like, well, I can evict you right now because you're breaking the contract of our lease or whatever. So I think in that aspect, there needs to be some, like, that contract protects her more than it protects them, in a sense that they can't seem to help other people. Like, so because in this situation, people in the house had moved from the above apartment, and they were all related to each other, but because they could only have so many people in that particular apartment, I don't know whether it was like a fire marshal thing or something, they never said that, but because of that, they felt like they were stuck, but there's no law protecting them, saying, like, was this in retaliation to? And again, these people are lower income, so they're not going to have enough money to fight back that eviction. They're just going to have to pick up and leave. So I think there could be a little bit more legislation to protect those that are in this particular cycle of paying rent and not having enough money to like always maybe buy food, but maybe might skip rent because they pay other bills like their heating or their plumbing or things like that. So I think that there might need to be like a little bit more legislation, at least according to this book. I'm not like an expert, obviously. So
Right.
this book is just showing so far in the first 4 chapters, shows a lot of loopholes that landlords can go through in order to get what they want without retaliating. So I didn't know what you thought of that particular.
Yeah, no, I think it makes a lot of. I think I agree with you. I think a lot of the legislation is nominally designed, or at least in theory designed to protect tenants, which some of it does. But I think like in practice, particularly in low income areas, I think what it really boils down to is like low income tenants really just don't have any leverage or power in this situation. Like, and this may be something the author addresses later in the book, but in this instance, like if the tenant is not able to make rent, or is able to pay rent, that's essentially in this context the only power they have. That is, like, if they're paying rent consistently and on time, then the landlord has no reason to withhold repairs, for example, or to evict them or whatnot. So in this instance, where there's individuals who just don't make enough money to afford rent, like, they really have no leverage. And I think that's what it really boils down to, is power. I think it's a matter of power imbalance in this case.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot more power in the landlord situation than there is in these low income family situations. So yeah, it's just very unfortunate so far in the first 4 chapters. It's just like, how can you help them to just kind of, because some of them get unemployment and things like that. It's just not, it's like nowhere near enough. Because I think they said in the book, I don't know specifically where, but the rent keeps going up, but their minimum wage and their assistance from the government does not go up. So then it's like, well, where do they get that in between? And it's only causing them to be more in debt to their landlord. And at some point, the landlord's just going to be like, well, you owe me $800, either pay it now or you need to leave. And a lot of them don't even make $800 a month to pay that on top of the other stuff that they still need to pay. So it's just unfortunate.
Yeah, I just think there's a lot of syndemic issue, or there's a large like constellation of problems that's kind of like compounding one another in this case. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, thinking about what we've talked about so far, like, I'm curious, like, from your perspective, like, how do you feel this kind of relates to these issues with eviction and whatnot? How do you think that relates to like public health in this context?
So I mean, when people get evicted, they may not have enough money to buy, or not buy, but like rent a new place, even buy a new place. They might not have money for that. So now they're in maybe like a shelter, they're on the street. They're not getting the necessary healthcare, food, water, things like that help upkeep their own general health. And when you can't get checked for certain health conditions, or you can't you can't like get certain services because maybe, I don't know, because maybe you don't have like an address to send stuff to or things like that, it can be difficult. And in certain situations where like homeless shelters are overcrowded, say someone has COVID-19, if it's overcrowded, all these people are going to get COVID-19. So there you go, all these cases. And when they're on the street, maybe they're asking for food or money from people in their cars, and someone rolls down their window and hands them something, no mask on for either of them. That person in the car could get it and then therefore spread it to wherever they're going, if for some whatever reason they're not wearing a mask or they're going home to their family. So I think this eviction situation problem is kind of exacerbating the downfalls of certain situations in public health that we're trying to address and make better.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like what you're saying is like it's kind of reinforcing and reproducing the health disparities that may already exist in populations.
Right.
So yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, part of the reason I bring that up is I was looking at one of the comments we got on Goodreads. I'm just going to read this out here because I think the person who wrote this did a really great job articulating it. I just want to read it. So Felicia Gross wrote, unstable housing and eviction can lead to traumatic experiences for individuals and families. When people have to spend more than half their income on housing, this fosters concern about how they're expected to cover the cost of other necessary expenses, health care, food, transportation, etc. Mental and physical health are negatively impacted by housing instability. Yeah, I was curious, like, what your thoughts were on that comment from one of our discussants.
I thought it was very insightful and very interesting. Yeah, so that unstableness is definitely a problem overall. Like, I don't know if there's any way to stabilize that this particular situation, but I think that government and like state, local, federal, I think they need to look into certain situations and see how that cycle is happening and find a way to kind of you can't stop eviction, but kind of help out with that, with the growing levels. So, yeah.
I agree. I think, this person articulated really well, kind of what's happening. What the author was really getting at, which is like this perpetuating system of inequality and health disparities that are existing. I think the mental health or the healthcare aspect here is especially prescient, like you were saying with the COVID-19 pandemic and just with other issues related to healthcare in general. I think it's also important to mention that, or to mention again, rather, that this book took place in, or the events of the book took place in 2007, 2008. It was roughly 12 years ago. And I think that, these issues haven't really changed much at all in that time. So I think that's something really, and, the author does allude to issues of health inequalities related to housing throughout much of American and even like European history. So I think these are like issues that are kind of very deeply entrenched in the way systems kind of operate currently. So I think it's important to be critical of that. I think, and then thinking about, some of the first few chapters of the book, I think one thing I found really interesting was in chapter 4, when they start talking about the mobile home community, what stuck out to me that was really interesting there was just the differences in housing, like even within the same city. Like they're not with like how like they're both low income communities, mind you, but like just the different ways in which they can be exploited was really interesting to me.
Sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
I found it very interesting that in chapter 4, when they were talking about the trailer park and things like that, I don't want to call him character. The person.
Well, they're all characters in one way.
Tobin, I guess he is the landlord of the entire complex. He is not nice. Like he'll make contracts, verbal contracts with people, and then they're like, "Oh no, I owe this," and he's like, "Oh no, it's 2 or 3 times that."
Yeah.
And I'm just, if it was that much money, why wouldn't you just write it down? Like I feel like in court, if you had to take them to court, and I just don't feel like his word would be something that's upstanding. But then I've noticed like sometimes they can favor the landlord in certain situations.
Yeah.
So he can just say whatever, and then if the tenant doesn't like it, he can just be like, okay, bye. Well, you need to leave. So.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think you really hit the nail on the head about like how like the law is set up to favor the landlord in this case, because like, in that chapter they were talking about like how Tobin, was about to lose his license. Like he was about to lose his license to even have the trailer park and to rent to tenants at all. But then at the last minute during his hearing, he basically made a deal with one of the committee members being like, okay, if I have a outside consultant firm like help me with these like complaints that have been happening with property, like for example, the raw sewage and like the trash and just the other issues, like then I'll be able to keep my license and continue paying out rent or renting property rather. But contingent upon that was the eviction of a large swath of the trailer park inhabitants for being quote unquote nuisances. That is like they were responsible. Like it's kind of like exactly what you're saying. Like the system is perpetuating, or rather, like favoring the landlord in this case. It's like, well, the nuisance complaints were derived from mostly trash and like issues of like waste disposal in the property. But that was also the reason that was an issue in the first place was the landlord was not keeping sanitation up to code. That is, like he wasn't maintaining the sewer system or the sewage system. He wasn't maintaining garbage pickup and whatnot. So it's like, well, it's kind of a catch-22. It's like, well, the tenants are being blamed for the refuse. They're being blamed for the unsanitary conditions, but it's like, but the reason the unsanitary conditions are there is because their landlord wasn't keeping the buildings or the property up to code. So it's like, like, do you see so exactly what you're saying? Like,
yeah, it's just, yeah, it's just, yeah, I don't know. Like, and then at the same time, again, they like, these tenants that they're describing don't sound like they don't have enough money to go to court and defend themselves in a way that these landlords do. So they just kind of like, I don't want to say like they give up, but they're like, okay, I mean, like, I can't do anything about it. So they just leave.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of like, I thought that, I don't know, I found that chapter with Tobin particularly engaging because like, I feel like the character of Tobin comes across as more of a villain in this. Maybe this is just the way the author is writing about this particular person. I do want to also say, like, we're not using these people's real names, obviously, because like, they're not using their real names in the book, and like, we don't want to vilify anyone per se. But at least the way this person is being written up in this book does make him sound very Machiavellian. It's like, it's interesting because prior to the committee meeting, he was making like you said before, he made verbal contracts with his tenants to try to work with them to get their rent paid. And the tenants, in addition, the tenants like talked to the media and talked about how great he was and whatnot. And basically tried to make it seem as if they really wanted to maintain, they weren't liked working, not that they liked him, but they enjoyed working with him to pay their rent and whatnot. And I think it's implied that he kind of encouraged that behavior and that talking to the media. But then when he was given the opportunity, he basically was like, okay, well, I'll evict all these people if I can continue making money in this capacity. So yeah. Just, I mean, like, compare that to someone like Sharina, who, like, obviously she is, profiting off of the system, but she does seem to show more compassion at the very least. Like, there's an example, I think, in the first chapter where one of the characters who comes out, one of the characters, Arlene, and her family, Sharina bought her, when she moved into the apartment, she bought her groceries, like, that first time. She knew that she had, like, just been recently homeless and, like, was just, was having a hard time. So yeah, I think that's interesting. Like, I don't know if you have any thoughts as to maybe why there is that disconnect about how, like, the compassion landlords show or don't show between those two situations. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't know. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just a matter of their character. But I think it's just something that they themselves are instilled with. They want to help and they want to do that for someone, the ones that are compassionate. But then there are some that it's just like, don't really care, or it's all about the money. So, which is like the difference between Sharina and Tobin, because I personally, at this point, I don't see Tobin buying groceries for anybody.
Yeah, no.
So I feel like there's almost no compassion there. So again, these are like certain situations, and obviously this is not like a giant book. So
Mm-hmm.
who knows if he's actually helped somebody, but the way that the author is depicting him is not being helpful.
Yeah.
To a certain
No,
extent.
definitely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like you almost don't want to make a deal with him because he's going to cause you to pay even more money past what you truly owed him.
Right.
But then again, you don't know if the tenants are remembering that conversation correctly as well. So it's really hard to figure out in that situation who's more at fault.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's very tricky. I do agree with you. I think there is a certain amount of just inherent or innate, for lack of a better term, personality differences between someone like Sharina and Tobin. In my head, I think it also has to come. I think it seems to be a little bit also of their backgrounds. That is, like, Sharina, lived in the north side of Milwaukee for a long time, and she, like, these are not just tenants; they're also to a certain degree her neighbors. So I feel like that maybe instills a different relationship. Whereas Tobin clearly, whereas Tobin inherited this property from his father, who was also a landlord, and I don't think it's explicitly stated, but I'm pretty sure he doesn't live near the actual trailer park. Like, I think he lives somewhere else. So I think that may also have a large impact on their relationship. And also, I think that this is just my interpretation. I think that racism, quite frankly, is also part of it. Like, I think in the case of I think in the case of the way redlining and whatnot has divided neighborhoods in the past, especially in America, like that has a lot of implications for how neighborhoods kind of look today, if that makes sense. So yeah, so maybe Sharina, who's also maybe Sharina, who she is also a woman of color. She's also dealt with systemic issues of racism and classism and whatnot. Maybe that gives her a different relationship with her tenants as opposed to Tobin, who is identified as a cisgender white male. That I'm assuming has a large impact on how he treats his tenants as well. So
absolutely, I think that's definitely something that's not explicitly said, but kind of can be interpreted in a way.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think that there are a lot of ways in which the systems kind of reinforce themselves and like kind of maintain those disparities in kind of health and whatnot. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, it was, it's kind of crazy to me, like thinking about how, like when they were describing, like in the early chapters of the book, when they're describing the actual physical locations, like it kind of boggled my mind a little bit. I was like, mind you, this is in Milwaukee. It gets cold in Milwaukee.
Yeah.
And these are buildings that are like missing walls and missing windows and like have no heat. I was like, holy cow, like that's insane. So
right. So when something's not like fixed in a timely manner, they really are in not as a bad a situation as if they were like living on the street, but they could still be at risk for a lot of concerning health problems, even mental health problems. Yeah, I can't imagine the amount of stress they are experiencing knowing that they barely can pay rent every month.
Yeah.
And if anything outside of the normal happens, it could set them back to the point where they could be evicted at some point during the year. So yeah, just that amount of stress, again, public health, that's a whole issue in itself too. So just so stressful.
Yeah.
They live a very stressful life. Those tenants live a very stressful life.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I totally agree. I think, that cumulative stress, obviously cannot be good. I mean, and also just like the conditions they're living in, like put them at risk of exposure to like myriad health issues, like lead exposure from like,
like some of those buildings are very old. As they have said in the book. So
yeah. This book is a lot. I mean, clearly. So, yeah. it's just so interesting. Like, um, yeah, there's like just so much. I mean, mind you, this is only the first 4 chapters. Like, there's even more stuff that comes up later. Like, not spoiler alert, more stuff happens, but yeah, there's just so much going on, like within these first 4 chapters, and so much to like unpack and like talk about. But yeah, there's just, I mean, one thing that um, kind of related to you talking about before about like the stress of these people, the stress of their lives and whatnot. It's kind of the cycle of like eviction and homelessness and whatnot. I think it also impacts like it's generational. Like it's not just the individual who suffers. It's also like their children and whatnot. Because like if like one of the characters, Arlene, for example, she has two teenage boys or two teenage sons rather. Um, and like I kept thinking about like how disruptive that must be, like at that stage of your life. Like you're already a young person, like you're trying to learn, you're trying to like develop your skills and like what have you. Like I can only imagine how disruptive it must be to like be bouncing from place to place, let alone adding on top of that like homelessness and whatnot, and like everything else that happens with that. So yeah, like I don't know what your thoughts were on like the family life and whatnot. But
yeah, so I can't, the stress that these children are experiencing probably is, I wouldn't say it's more than the parents, because I'm sure that these parents are like, they're working all the time and they still can't figure out like how to properly feed their children and things like that. Whereas these children are trying to learn and have a social life and things like that. And so I think right now, especially during like COVID-19, when they have to do online learning and things like that, I don't think these families in these situations even have internet in the house. That's, I mean, they could have internet. I've never said that they didn't have internet or they did,
right.
But from my understanding, the level of maintenance these places need, it doesn't sound like internet is at that top of the list. So in a situation like this currently, these children could also be not learning like anything,
Yeah.
which is again setting them back to have have a like a high school degree, be able to go to college or get a trade or go, like make more money than their parents may have been able to make. So I think it's putting them at risk for, I don't know the proper word, because I don't want to be offensive, but I just don't like it. It sets them back in a way, I guess. And it's disheartening, I'm sure, for not only the children but for the parents. And I mean, I know that sometimes these children might have to get a job while they're in high school, so they don't actually learn, so they don't get their high school diploma and things like that. So again, that's setting them back. And that's all because their parents can't pay or need help paying for not just the rent, but for the other added bills that go along with that. So
yeah, that's a really excellent point about how in our current situation with like COVID and whatnot, like how these inequalities may be further perpetuated because like people don't have access to stable internet and can't participate in online learning or working remotely or anything like that. That's so interesting. So like thinking a little, like this might be a little far afield, but I'm curious, like I wonder how that is going to impact people like in the next couple of years. Like I'm curious like how many people are going to like be behind, like how many students rather going to be behind like their reading or test scores, like if there might be increased dropouts rates or things like that. That's interesting. I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I can only imagine that there would be increased dropout rates, because from personal experience, I know I have neighbors and their sons they usually get like A's and B's in high school, and right now they're getting like D's and F's, and so
wow.
It's a very drastic change in the way they are getting this education. Maybe they feel like they can't, like, you can't just like go into the office and be like, I need help with this, I don't understand. You have to like schedule an appointment, make sure you show up to the appointment, make sure you
Mm.
remember the appointment, make sure you don't schedule anything over that appointment. And same thing on the instructor's side. So I know that that can be a very huge barrier, even when you have all the access to the internet in the world. And I know my mom has actually said, she was like, if I had a kid right now during this situation and being online, she was like, I would just have to hold them back if they weren't getting, if their grades weren't where I know that they usually are. I mean, so I can only imagine how people who don't have adequate access to internet can really like fall behind in ways that are not their fault at all.
Yeah.
So this is a huge public health issue.
Yeah, for real.
Homelessness and eviction just causes a plethora of problems that I don't think people truly realize unless they've read maybe a book like this or stay up to date with information in their community. So
yeah, you know, it's interesting you say that, because like I had a conversation with someone recently about, not necessarily like we were talking about this book at the time, but like they said something to the effect of like, you know, oh well, because I was saying to them about like how I was reading this book and I was going to be discussing it for this book club, and they were like, oh well, you know, maybe they should just pay the rent. And I was like trying to explain to them, I was like, well, it's not that simple. Like it's not just like they're not just paying the rent because they just don't feel like it. Like they don't have the money. Like,
right.
And they were like, oh well, you know, if I got evicted, like, you know, I'd be using social services and I'd be like doing this, that. And I was like, okay, like you say that, like, but you know, not to be not, you know, to get too far ahead of ourselves with the book, but they do talk about in later chapters about how it's interesting how much work goes into being being unemployed and, you know, poverty. That is like, you know, these people are extremely industrious. They like, it's clear that these individuals like are working very hard to try to get themselves out of situations they're in. It's extremely difficult. And like, there's a lot of barriers in place, you know, like, yeah, it's just kind of crazy. And then like, I agree with you. I think people don't realize the tremendous amount of work that, you know, goes into this, and like, you know, how these systems kind of like are barriers to a lot of people. So
yes. And to the point that your friend was talking about, like, oh, they would use the social services or whatever. Like, I don't know, like right now, there are so many people unemployed and getting evicted. Do you know how long you would have to wait just to have that first meeting, like, and make sure that your paperwork is correct? Because what if your paperwork's not correct? They might say, you need to go back and fix this and send you to the end of the line. So then that's a whole nother maybe like month, 2 months, 3 months, who knows? So I don't think people realize how hard it is to not to live paycheck by paycheck, but how hard it is to stay afloat when you don't really have any type of like netting underneath you.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
It's important that people kind of put themselves in other people's shoes, or at least try and be more educated about certain situations when it comes to this, because I know sometimes, I mean, I've heard people say like, well, they're probably just lazy. And I'm like, no, this person works like 3 jobs. How many jobs do you work? Like,
right.
And they still don't make as much as you. So it's just, yeah, it's very frustrating to hear people like kind of belittle people who are truly trying to better their situation. Because I mean, there's always someone who just doesn't care about their situation, like they're not really trying to make it better, but there are plenty of people that are. And I don't think it's fair for the general public to put that burden on the entire population, because that's maybe how it's depicted in certain situations.
Right.
So
yeah, I agree with you. I think like to a large extent, like a lot of these issues are just syndemic. It's like these systems are put in place that perpetuate inequality. And you know, people try very hard to get out of that cycle, but like it's extraordinarily challenging. Like that's why, you know, it's so uncommon for those who were born to poverty to leave it at some point.
Right.
Like it's just set up in such that like, yeah. So Yeah, and I think this book is a great, example of that. Like the author describes in a lot of detail, like how these systems are put in place, which make it harder for people to pay, just making it challenging for people to pay their rent and avoid homelessness and just have and I mean, really, at the end of the day, what the author to me is saying is like he's drawing attention to a business model that is based upon this system. It's like it's a business model entirely predicated on the idea that people are going to be evicted. Like there's a requirement for high turnover and a requirement for people to be evicted and made homeless and whatnot. So yeah, that really it's really interesting and horrible and what have you. So
it's not great. It's definitely not great.
No. Yeah. So so yeah, I mean, like we've talked about a lot today. I mean, in a short amount of time. Clearly, this is a very there's a lot of themes and topics in this book and whatnot. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything else you wanted to discuss or to talk about, or?
We've talked about everything that I've in the first 4 chapters, so even almost beyond those chapters. So
yeah,
so
I think
I don't have anything else to discuss unless you do.
No, I think we covered a lot, and I think like I think for me at least the issue is like there's so much like because I've read ahead like I'm like so there's other stuff I want to like that I want to discuss that I want, but I know other people haven't gotten that far in the book yet because we're only doing chapters 1 to 4 today.
Right.
So yeah, all right, cool. Well, I guess we'll end it there for today. Yeah, and then all right. So this was the first in a series of book discussions Ashley and I will be having. Yeah, I think I don't recall which are the next chapters we'll be discussing, Ashley.
5 through 8. So we're just finishing up part 1 of the book.
Cool. Perfect. Awesome. Yes. So we'll be doing those. So we'll post a discussion thread on Goodreads for the next set of chapters. And yeah, feel free to, post whatever questions you have. Yeah, and reach out to us if you have any comments you want us to talk about during our discussion today. So cool.